Again, it's 3 p.m. Friday, February 28th, 2025. My name is Ruben Leyva, and I welcome all of you to this opportunity for us to share some time together to sit and to listen and think deeply about the history of the area, in particular the region of the Mimbres and the Gila as it relates to history. And there isn't a complete history of the area without a discussion about the Apache. There's often talk about the Membreños Puebloan pottery and the associated culture, but sometimes we gloss over the Apache on our way to the first wilderness in the United States, the Gila. And so it's important that we take a moment to fill in some gaps, but also hopefully to refresh our recollection and to open our minds to new possibilities. And so this is why we are here today. I will do a formal introduction here shortly. I see people still entering the Zoom. I will announce this again at the end, but I will be in person with you for those that can make it on April the 11th at the same time, 3 p.m. Someone asked if I was going to present and be on Zoom because they were not in the area. And I hadn't accounted for that. But in speaking with Mrs. Galloway there at the library, she was open to the idea of us doing two. One in Zoom for those that couldn't make it, and then one in person specifically for the Silver City community. So I'm looking forward to that opportunity as well. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Diving deeply into Apache family history, I want to acknowledge those in the area of Silver City, surrounding communities, the Silver City Library and its staff and management for the opportunity to present. I want to acknowledge the Apache living in the area and all of the work that they're doing to educate the public. I ran into some of them at the Harvest Festival, and it was an honor to engage and interact. I live in Las Cruces, so I'm broadcasting today from this location. It's not terribly far away, but due to some other commitments, this is going to work out perfect for my schedule. All right. When we talk about the Apache, we have to talk about them in terms of a language family. In fact, the Apache, some say, are made up of a number of tribes who did not come to peace with the three settler states individually, but did so collectively. And those would be Spain, the Mexican Republic, and the United States. And so folks who were living independent of those newer settler societies were categorized as Apache, and they spoke a language that descends based on this language tree from the Na-Dene and on down to what we know today as the Chiricahua or the Gila Apache. The group also includes the Jicarilla Apache, the Navajo or the Dene, the Mescalero, and to the left, you'll see the Western Apache, the Lipan Apache, and the Kiowa Apache. The groups, in many cases, not all, but in many cases, were matrilocal. They traveled subsistence rounds, gathering food and hunting game in specific areas that they knew over time. They could collect those plant foods and animals. They foraged throughout the year for different sorts of things to eat. Cactus foods like the prickly pear or the nopales, the mescal, the yucca, the soto, and different other agave plants. And so someone reminded me recently that the food terminology known as the food desert, meaning not much healthy food in the area, wasn't true of the Apache because we managed to find food in the desert just fine. At times, there were cases when there wasn't enough to go around for different reasons, drought, etc. But by and large, we were able to sustain ourselves. In addition to being foragers and hunters, we were also dry farmers and possessed those skills in time dating back to some of the earlier Spanish records. We didn't produce as much corn and other agriculture as some of the Pueblo tribes, but we did produce corn and some squash and beans. We were mountain people, particularly in the summertime, in the warmer months of the year, and went to the valleys in the colder times of the year. We were borderlanders, meaning we existed in an area that encompassed the modern southern USA-Mexico border. We were diplomats. We were male and female diplomats. Some of our more significant peace negotiations highly involved our female band members. We were refugees within our own country, hoping not to be made prisoners of war, but some of our relatives were imprisoned. And some were taken from their homelands to Florida and Alabama, and ultimately Fort Sill, Oklahoma, before ultimately being freed of that prisoner of war status. Some remained there, but the large majority moved to the Mescalero Reservation, east of the Rio Grande. I am here representing myself as a scholar, but I am a student of the Doctor of Philosophy program in Native American Studies at the University of New Mexico. I'm also a member of the Chihenne Inde Nation. On the left-hand side of the screen is a screenshot from the Bureau of Indian Affairs Petitions and Process page, and petition number 404, the Chihenne Inde Nation, is my tribe's petition. We are currently not recognized. We're a non-federally recognized tribe seeking federal recognition with the United States government. The map that is set behind this screenshot was taken in the governor's palace in New Mexico within the last month during the Treaty Days celebration. And as you can see down here, there is a purple dot, and I'll cover it with my light blue dot from my cursor that says Chihena Indian Nation. This dot probably should be moved west of the Rio Grande, but we are among other non-federally recognized tribes seeking federal acknowledgement below. On the right-hand side is a close-up of the picture on the left. I don't want to introduce myself without introducing my ancestors, and so please indulge me. Dagote shish Ruben Leyva gonse. Shi dashle shi bil se hila inde se tose inde chique inde quemado New Mexico. I said, how are you? My name is Ruben Leyva, and my ancestors are from the Gila area in Quemado, New Mexico. For those that are not familiar with that, it's probably a couple hours north of you. If you headed up past Reserve, you would end up close to Pie Town and Quemado. And we'll go ahead and open with an Apache prayer to honor the ancestors. It says, Ifte shibike ewandan. Go ishna ta chike. Beda gojishi. Aku istanisklese. Night neskani. Tu basischi. Ildu. Go lishna. Usendu. Yasta sita sita inne. Night heransi. In jugo. Nahidara den I. Night gutli. Naza ishi. Nahi ati ibich. Intilku. Naha anzi. Ihehe. I was basically saying, the story says that we always knew that the Creator existed, and so did the white painted woman and her children, the dragon slayer, the killer of enemies, and the child born of water, and that we wanted Usen, God, the captain of heaven, to look over us, our culture, help us preserve it, our language, and be with us. Yeah. So this is very important. All of these people that you're seeing are related to me, but I draw your attention to the group at the very bottom in the center in front of a church, and this church is the temple of San Lorenzo del Rio de Mimbres, New Mexico. So San Lorenzo on the Rio Mimbres, the River Mimbres. October of, looks like 1910. So we have family living there in 1910, but they weren't living on reservations. If I want to think about this deeply, it's very curious that we might have Apache and descendants of Apache and survivors of Apache living in this community and not on reservations, and not necessarily considered Mexican. In the upper left-hand corner in the 1940s, there were the beginnings of the pilgrimages. This was the first in the area of Sunland Park, New Mexico. many indigenous families, also not on reservations, both from El Paso and New Mexico, pilgrimage up Mount Cristo Rey, along with communities south of the border in Juarez, who would, at that time, prior to border enforcement, come up their side of the mountain. The picture in the center at the top, headed right of a woman, Gila Leyva, was taken in the Luna County area. The family lived along the Mimbres and intermarried with the Schwartz family. Schwartz, S-W-A-R-T-Z, Schwartz family, not S-C-H, S-W. Other family members here include some ancestors who escaped being taken to Florida and lived freely, either as farmers or in the Sierra Madre Mountains as refugees just south of the border. When Geronimo surrendered, many of them retreated to that location. When we talk about the Chiricahua or the Gila Apache, we're talking about 4 specific bands. Today, they're more known by reservations than nations, but historically, the Chi'ende, the Warm Springs, occupied this upper area along with the Bidankeende or Bedonkohe, below them and also into Arizona. Here in Arizona, the Chukoende, and below them, the Inde or Inde Indahe. And people don't often associate the Apache with the being south of our border, but I'm going to hopefully educate you on proof of our existence much further south than most might imagine. The Mogollon Indendahe, specifically this group, was known to travel all of this distance that is circled on this map. It's really quite amazing to have family at all different parts of both present-day United States, in southwest New Mexico, southeastern Arizona, and along the Sierra Madre Occidental, all the way to Durango, and some say beyond. My family's history confirms that our political relationship with Chihuahua and Durango, formerly Nueva Vizcaya, and Sonora was often inconsistent. The historian Ralph A. Smith wrote about my Mogollon Apache ancestors, stating their plunder road pushed deeper into Mexico than any of the 5 major Apache war trails that cross the present international boundary. A year later, Smith's article, Indians in American-Mexican Relations Before the War of 1846, noted as Apache raiders, the Mogollaneros held a primacy in distance traveled southward and southeastward to the middle and upper Conchos River and even Durango. So I was in discussions with folks, and they said, first of all, I didn't realize that you all went all the way up to the Zuni Pueblo. When I think about the Chiricahua or the Gila Apache, I think really about the area around Silver City, down into the Boot Hill and southeastern Arizona into the Chiricahua Mountains, but I don't associate you all with that great distance. And they went on to say, I also don't associate you all with El Paso, but the fact of the matter is that that is our ancestral homelands, and we signed treaties along the Rio Grande River as well. In particular, 1855. I've written a number of editorials thanks to the Grant County Beat and the team there that works so hard to keep us all informed of what's happening in the area. And the relationship started in preparation for the Red Paint Powwow and wanting to make sure that people were in the mood for celebrating an annual event with the Apache. And so we started posting some of these articles. And I thank my good friend Carl Lombach and for all of his help, Dr. Jeff Shepard and others who I consult with as part of my process in making sure that this information that you're receiving is accurate and aligns with histories, but at the same time while sharing it from my own personal perspective. So you can find all of these under the editorial section in some form. I've been asked about my process. How am I finding all of this information out? And I'm here to tell you it is a very tedious and time-intensive process. Mm-hmm. It's not just something that can be done in all cases or for everyone. I look at primary source documents, secondary source documents, tertiary sources, government documents. I read theses and dissertations of other scholars. Read all of these books. I have a lot of books. I read journal articles. I visit websites, read old newspapers and magazines, many no longer in publication. And I also, most importantly, analyze church records. That is something that has been done before, maybe not necessarily in this particular case, but authors like L.R. Bailey and David M. Brugge wrote about the Indian slave trade in the Southwest, and in particular, the Apache in the Catholic Church. The book Navajo in the Catholic Church was a book authored by Brugge, but he prefaces it stating that at that time, the Navajo were known as Apaches de Navajo. And so oftentimes, that is how we will see them in the records. There are documented sacraments in old records, and there were many people over the years here in New Mexico who pushed for those to be made available and for those to be made available online. And with continuous prodding, we have a lot of access that we didn't have many years ago. According to Brugge, the Apachean groups, the Navajos and the Apaches, significantly surpassed other tribes in New Mexico as it relates to conversion, with a recorded total of 2,652 baptisms between the years 1700 and 1870. And so the missing part of the discussion is the fact that it is taboo for Apache to mention the names of their ancestors. So we don't speak their Apache names for fear of disturbing them at the happy place. But if you live amongst the families, there's a chance you have a Spanish surname. And if you do, there's a possibility that someone in your family at some point was converted. And based on that, you can go through the meticulous church records associated with the areas if you know where your family lived and where they traveled or where they were taken, and you can trace back your ancestry. And a lot of people don't know this. My most recent article on the Grant County beat is this article here, Apache Baptisms and Spanish Names. In particular, I talk about my family who in 1785 was attacked in the Datil Mountains of Catron County, 40 of us killed, and then others subsequently in the San Mateos and so on being defeated, and many in the Chiricahua Mountains wanting to rest, recover, and not suffer any additional losses to the Spanish or any of the tribes they had engaged in support of bringing an end to our existence. And so in 1786, we agreed to come live near a Spanish presidio in Bacoachi, Sonora, at a peace establishment. And so this document on the right-hand side is a roll by Leonardo Escalante, the commissioner at that time, that is available through the University of Arizona's repository. I have the originals of these, or at least duplicates of the originals, but this is a document available on their website, and in it lists a number of people that I have connections to, ancestors of mine. Some of the names are Apache names, but as you see, some of them are Spanish names. What many people don't realize as well is that prior to the United States, this area that I'm describing, where the Spanish were occupying, was just south of today's border. And by 1790, 1791 timeframe, my family was asked to relocate some of the family members over to Janos. And Janos is here just north of Casas Grandes and south of the border. Well, what's interesting is that this Janos district included Santa Rita del Cobre, which is the mining area or district in Silver City. So here we see, before the Gadsden Purchase, before the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, in the early 1800s, people are starting to mine with the help of my ancestors showing them the Copper Range. And it's documented through records that that particular area where you're living was a settlement prior to being American-owned mines. There's a family story and a history associated with that area, and I've written a poem about it I'm going to read to you. Beneath the burning sun of Santa Rita's sky, the land was torn and the earth did cry. The mine's cold wealth from copper drawn, yet on this soil, Corazon was gone. Apaches, the keepers of this land, face violence from an ever-reaching hand. Apache scalps became the price of might. A peso paid erased life from sight. 100 a man, a warrior slain, for women 50, children less in pain. Bounty hunters roamed with hearts of steel, while silver fed the hunger none could heal. Sonora's grim decree rang clear, a war project financed by fear. The hunt was on, the bounty high and cruel, for those who once had lived by nature's rule. Yet in the hills where dust and shadows play, an Apache voice sought peace that fateful day. Juan Jose wrote with hope, his words sincere to Calvo, governor, with reason near. But trust was shattered, violence unchecked, in Animus Mountains, where death's hand was decked. John Johnson's massacre with hatred deep did spill the blood that no one dared to keep. Juan Jose and Juan Diego, kin so dear, were caught within that murderous frontier. And thus the hope of peace was buried low. Beneath the cries of anguish none could know. The mine still churned its wealth like poisoned spread. Yet the winds, the ghosts of those long dead, still call for justice in the earth and sky, where once the free Apache walked so high. What happened was that my ancestors, the Compa family, who were part of the peaceful Apache who led Spaniards to the Copper Range, served as intermediaries with Apache groups living in the hinterlands and not at peace. And unfortunately, that situation ran dry when Juan Jose, who was the leader of the peaceful Apache, along with his brother, were no longer being respected on either front, and they had a choice to make. The Spanish did not believe they were wielding the influence needed to control the warring groups of Apache, and the Apache that were living in the traditional way were not supporting what Juan Jose was communicating on behalf of the Spaniards. And so in the 1830s, the early 1830s, my family left the Presidio and returned to the traditional way of life. But there was a situation where it is documented they raided the village of Noria near Bavitspe, Sonora, taking with them cattle and prisoners and leaving prisoners for dead in the Noria Canyon. And the government the Mexican government sanctioning this John Johnson to return the cattle and bring justice to this matter. So under the guise of a peaceful gathering where food would be eaten and shared, a hidden cannon owned by Johnson and his men was lighted and revealed an open fire on the Apache sitting there, killing a number of them. And as a result, leaders like Mangus Coloradus, who you've heard, there's a Mangus Spring. He was said to have lived at Santa Lucia. And this area is right there at Silver City. It says in Spanish, his nickname was Red Sleeves. It translated Mangus Coloradus. Some attribute the name to the Apache leader's red-colored shirt he acquired during a raid. He was quite the charismatic and sizable leader, said to be over 6.5 feet tall. In fact, in 1846, General Stephen Kearny stopped at the Apache village there in Silver City, and his troops engaged with Mangus Coloradus right there in your hometown. That event is described in the book Mangus Coloradus by Edwin R. Sweeney. In 1852, Mangus Coloradus and other Apache leaders, including his sibling, Nerio, signed a treaty with the United States on behalf of the family and other Apaches, all relatives of mine. And that was ratified by the U.S. Senate and proclaimed by President Franklin Pierce. What you see here is some of my research into Mangus Coloradus through church records. And my best guesstimate is that he was the adopted child of an Apache leader, Mako. In fact, by 5 years old, this Jose Marcelino Sixto Matarino had lost both of his parents, but they weren't the only Matarinos in the community. And so as a result, he is seen as the sibling of other Apache leaders who descend from Mako. Below is an old church record, and as you investigate it, you'll learn that it describes a number of things: the place, the date, the people involved, meaning the name of the child, the parents if possible, godparents in some cases, even the age of the child. So this says niño, meaning a child. It doesn't say how many days or something. So we could imagine that it could have been a young child. But on this date, there's a name, Ascencio Matarino, YDO. I direct your attention to this abbreviation. YDO is an abbreviation for YNDIO, or Indio, meaning Native American. And for the female parent, YDA, India. So looking back through some of these old records and tracing back their connections can tell us a lot. As we learn from authors like Brugge, the records don't always indicate exactly what band or what tribe, sometimes just Indio, and then later on, in the early 1800s, we stopped seeing consistent documentation of the fact that they are indigenous. Only in some of the more remote areas does that practice carry on. This is another article that I've written for the Grant County Beat, and it talks about the relationship that Mako had with Mangus coloratus, his adopted son. But Mangus coloratus is a cultural hero for my people. He symbolizes so much more to us because there's documentation through the military, Captain Enoch Steen, who met with him. Again, we talked about General Stephen Kearney. We talked about other leaders in these articles, in particular, Captain Enoch Steen, who met with Mangus coloratus, and he met with John C. Cremoni as part of the Boundary Commission's work. But the sad part about it was that he trusted the United States at a time when he should not have. On January 18th, 1863, the U.S. Army troops killed this tall, imposing leader after torturing him at Fort McLean. His body was dismembered and his skull was sent to the Smithsonian for phrenology. The Apache believe he took his desecrated body into the Apache afterlife. He was 70 years old when the troops tortured and murdered him. This is a sketch not many of you have seen, but it's a sketch of your community. Actually, this is the Presidio and other buildings at the copper mines. And this was drawn by the Boundary Commissioner, John Russell Bartlett, in August of 1851. This is courtesy of the collection at the John Carter Brown Library. He was the Boundary Commissioner, and they were taking these surveys in the early 1850s. So the town and mines at Santa Rita, pictured here, are the place where he met Mangus coloratus in 1851. Today, this area has been swallowed up by the large pit mining going on there. But you can sort of get an idea of how things looked in that valley at that time. In particular, this triangular shaped building, the fort slash jail slash presidio, was a part of the outpost there to help protect the small town from Apache raids. My family has a deep connection with Mangus coloratus. In fact, there's information within the article posted in the Grant County Beat commemorating Mangus coloratus in the editorial section that talks about the story behind the New Mexico community's name. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see the Salt Lake at Zuni, Quemado, New Mexico, and the community of Mangus. South of that, the plains of St. Augustine. Beneath there to the east, the Tularosa River and the San Francisco River. Southwest of there in the Mogollon Mountains. We see Negrito Creek that runs through there. I want to make sure that we all understand that and draw reference to Mangus's brother Negrito, who was known as Negrito in ancient times. And what is of particular interest to me is the fact that we have a Mangus Creek in Catron County, and there's also a Mangus Creek in Grant County. So the family is associated with both areas. In his book, Robert Julian, who wrote The Place Names of New Mexico, says Mangus, this community, was known as Pinoville, likely for a family named Pino. The first settlers are said to have been Jose Maria Baca along with members of the Leyva family. My family still lives there. We still have people living there. My cousin, Ana Baca, is a descendant of the Baca and the Leyva family. And she was going to do her best to be on the call today. So it's interesting to look back at United States documents of family existence as far back as 1914 in these areas, but also understanding that these people who were the survivors were not restricted to reservations. But as you know, these areas were very remote back then. And so not everyone knew that we were living in these mountains or living in the mountains south of the border in the Sierra Madres. The Apache Geronimo speaks about the Zuni Salt Lakes. He says in his story, we obtained our salt from a little lake in the Gila Mountains. This was a very small lake of clear, shallow water, and in the center, a small mound arises above the surface of the water. The water is too salty to drink, and the bottom of the lake is covered with a brown crust. When this crust is broken, cakes of salt adhere to it. These cakes of salt may be washed clear in the water of this lake, but if washed in other water, will dissolve. I have some of that salt in my possession and is considered sacred to my people. In particular, is a family member's record, a church record of baptism of a Jose Manuel Matarino, who would have been one of the nephews of Mangus Colorados, who had siblings Antonia and Vicente, among others, that has a birth date exactly 1 year off from the popular birth date we know that Geronimo had. These records say he was born in 1829, but this record says 1828. Could that record have been off a year? Oftentimes, we do know of ancestors who may have thought they were born a year later. Antonia, or Ishton, is documented as a sister of Geronimo's in the records. Vicente is documented as a brother of Geronimo's in the records. Historically, he rode with the Apache leader Victorio. But after Mangus left this earthly plane, Geronimo did not necessarily become a chief of our people. He did have a following, however, but he was never a chief. He was a medicine man and a war leader. But there were other Mogollon, Inde, and Dahe leaders, like Andres Maturino Suba, aka Escani, my third great grandfather, also known as Esquine in some records, or Haskenatisha, angry, he is agitated. And he was a contemporary of Geronimo Chato, Jose Maria Elias, and Francisco Leyva. Throughout his life, Escani, a leader of our people, made temporary peace. He joined his brother, Nailse, another identified sister, or an unidentified sister at the Chiricahua Apache Indian Agency. These siblings had married into Cochise's Chiconen Apache band. Escani remained there until Cochise's passing in 1876. However, he and Geronimo were up to no good in December of that year. They executed a horse theft near Camp Crittenden on Sonita Creek in southern Arizona. A report of that activity was sent to Fort Bowie, which was an established base of operations for a company of Apache scouts under the command of the second Lieutenant John Anthony or Tony Rucker. They trailed my family's group, who left Arizona and entered New Mexico, headed south into New Mexico's Animas Mountains. Those Animas Mountains have been bad news for my family. On January 9th, 1877, U.S. troops led by Rucker launched a surprise attack on our camp just after a nighttime dance. Among those present was Geronimo. Now, when we say nighttime dance, that dance is not necessarily like your nighttime dance. We're not going to get right up and go to work the next day. That dance might go till daybreak. So when everyone was tired that morning, we were attacked. They seized our weapons, our horses, and took captives. Reflecting on this tragic event in his autobiography, his story, Geronimo lamented the loss of life and the harsh winter conditions that followed, leading Escani and Geronimo to seek refuge with Francisco Leyva's people. Francisco was Escani's son-in-law. Escani had married Abelina Villa, and their daughter married Francisco Leyva. That's how I'm related. By late April that same year, at the Ojo Caliente Reservation, where Francisco's mother was living, Indian agent John Clum, along with the San Carlos Apache police, arrested Geronimo and several others, including Francisco. But why? They were on a reservation. They weren't on the reservation that John Clum intended for them to live. He wanted us on the San Carlos Apache reservation, and we had promised Geronimo, along with the Apache leader whose name was Lino Leyva, had promised that they would gather their people and report to San Carlos after the closing of the Chiricahua Apache Indian Reservation, but they did not do so. And so therefore they had gone back on their word and upset John Clum, the Indian agent. And when he learned that they were at the Ojo Caliente near the Rio Grande, he asked for permission from the military to apprehend them. He was supposed to wait until the military arrived. He got there, and to prevent the startling of Geronimo and Francisco and the others, he called them to the reservation agent's offices. They thought nothing of it. It was a rations distribution day, and he and the Apache police from San Carlos were waiting. There they were taken to the blacksmith and put in chains and taken to San Carlos, where they were temporarily jailed. Subsequent to that, Victorio and local leaders, along with Francisco's in-laws, or Francisco's family, the in-laws of Esquine, were asked to also relocate from the Ojo Caliente to San Carlos. This is a picture of the San Carlos guardhouse and the Apache policeman that was taken by C.S. Fly. And I have a poem about that I want to share with you. The agent sent a message smooth as sand. Come talk, just 3 miles, and bring the band. Geronimo Ponce Francisco, too. Heard the call, thought nothing new. Morning sun rising at Warm Springs, they walked with grace, no betrayal brings. To the agency building at the agent's behest, surprised to see Clum and the rest. A ruse, a trick behind white eyes, his San Carlos police in silent guise. Escorted like kings, but chains lay near. At the blacksmith's forge, no man shed tear. Iron shackles, mouths held tight, bound their freedom in morning light. For transport to San Carlos, caged away, where Apache pride had no say. But even in chains, they stood tall. Spirit rises, no matter the fall. This is a picture after one of the breakouts, the last, in fact, Geronimo had. And it is said to be the only photograph or photographs taken of a Native American tribe still at war with the United States. Geronimo's in the center holding a water drum. We have the Chocona leader and son of Cochise, Naiche, to the far right. But I draw your attention to the gentleman kneeling beside him. That is Jose Maria Nakutbae Elias. Nakutbae is one of the leaders of the group who was not captured and taken to Fort Bowie, but instead, on the way to Fort Bowie, escaped to the Sierra Madre Mountains and led my family there. And this other gentleman, Ato Nietse, who is in the center here with the white paint across his face, was also a leader who escaped and led a group in the Sierra Madre Mountains. In particular, what's interesting about Ato Nietse is that he was said to be the son of Nailse. And Nailse was the brother of Iskini, my third great grandfather, and the war chief for Cochise. So you can see the family connections are here, and people that deeply knew each other under certain circumstances remain together. The Chi'ena Nation, it comprises the surviving Apache families who signed treaties with the United States in Chi'ena territory. This is one of the more recent gatherings in the Gila National Forest. I want to thank all of you. I think we still have time for questions. It's 4 o'clock. It's been exactly 1 hour. I'll be in person again for the folks in Silver City at the library on April 11th at 3 p.m. Mountain Time, doing a presentation that's entitled Hansta Daka Inde, meaning the Apache are coming for a gift. And then I'll be in Quemado, New Mexico, thanks to my cousins there, at the Quemado Museum on May 10th, 2025 at 1 p.m. Mountain, also in person. And the title of that will be Mangus Coloradus Connection. And I would like to open this up to questions. However, I do want to remind everyone that we are recording. And so I don't know if we should stop the recording for the questions. I'm asking my support staff there at the library so that we don't put, are we okay with that?
I'm okay with keeping it on, or unless everybody would rather we don't.
I think just as long as people know that they're being recorded, then they can make the decision whether or not to ask a question. Okay.
I think we had one on Zoom there.
All right. I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen here. Oh, that's my cousin, Anna. Yes, cousin. Beautiful cousin.
Yeah, she's already unmuted.
I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and then we can hear you.
Hello.
Hello, cousin.
How are you? I wanted to ask you if you could repeat that information about Francisco Leyva and how he's related to you. I didn't catch it all.
Yes. So Francisco Leyva is my second great grandfather. And Francisco had a brother named Jose.
Yeah,
and
my
Jose
grandfather.
is your grandfather. Yes, thank you for helping me clarify that.
So Jose and Francisco are brothers?
Yes. And they had other siblings.
Oh.
They had a sister who at this point in time, I'm still working on identifying her name. It seems as though in some cases it may have been lost to record, but I am intent on finding that out. But they had a younger brother with, and these siblings, they had a different father. Their father's name was Hastings. And Hastings married Norberta Ishnoe after the passing of her first husband, Manuel, they call it Manuelito, and he was a Gila Apache leader at Janos, but he was also a Mogollon Gila Apache. So what we know about Hastings' children is that the daughter whose name was lost to time married Toslani. And Toslani was, some say Toklani, was a very important or significant leader of the Chiricahua prisoners of war after they had been released at Fort Sill, and then some went to Mescalero. And his name means a lot of water.
A lot of water. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Tuflani. And unfortunately, this great aunt of ours, she passed away and they didn't have any children together. She was his second wife. The first wife didn't work out, and the second wife passed away, and he married another woman, Siki. And she was a Warm Springs Apache. They say all of his wives were from the Warm Springs. And Siki was captured and after Tres Castillos with Apache Victorio, taken to Chihuahua city area and further down potentially, and escaped, making her way back to her people. So she's a long story about that. I'll tell all of you one day. It's a good story of a woman hero or heroine among our people. But there is also,
Thank you.
yes, a younger sibling too. It was known as Jim Miller. He got that name from the United States. And Jim Miller's surviving ancestors or descendants, I'm sorry, surviving descendants are on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, and I know some of them.
Excuse me, how
Thank
does
you,
he get
Cousin.
the name Miller?
Well, what happened was when the Apache went to boarding schools in some cases or joined the military in other cases, the United States gave them other names.
Okay.
And they gave them English names or names that they were comfortable with pronouncing.
No, okay.
So
Understand.
he had a nickname. Chiricahua Jim was his nickname, and then we get the name Jim Miller later. But it is very common for people to have had their names changed by the United States. Yes.
Okay. I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Chat.
You're muted.
This is from Paul Shimmick, who is outside of the United States. He's writing in, I think, from the UK, if I'm not mistaken. He says, "Thank you, Mr. Leyva. This was very interesting. There must be a large amount of documentation in Mexican and Spanish archives. Have you yourself, with anyone else, spent any time trying to access to official archives regarding Apache history?" Yes. Other than the churches, yeah, I do it all the time. In fact, that was part of the reason why I went to Chihuahua over the summer, was to familiarize myself with the geography and to talk to some of the historical experts down there. And we went through some records there at one of the cultural centers and had explanations from historians there on how to interpret these records from their perspective. In addition to that, I have the fortune of studying at the University of New Mexico and spending time on a routine basis at the Southwest Center for Historical Research Collections there. And so that's of great benefit to me. I was also over at the new Labriola Library at ASU, Arizona State University recently. And so there's a lot of archival information that's available here at churches, online, and just an excellent question. But also military records, right? Historical military records, looking at the reports of people like, in particular, I'm going to grab a book off my shelf. Leonard Lane's book. He looks at Leonard Wood's notes. Leonard Wood was the military officer responsible for bringing Geronimo in, and to look through all of his records and his diary of daily events, we can find my ancestors in there day by day and the roles that they were playing and what they were doing. So military records, as well as all of the other 10 sources I cited on the earlier slide: primary, secondary, tertiary, government, church, thesis and dissertation, as well as journal articles and other important sources of information like newspapers that document movement of my ancestors. So great question. And he says, "Thank you. I'm sure it's very interesting to read and hear things from so many different perspectives. The real truth is often somewhere in between all the versions. I'm actually in the US in New Hampshire. Right on. Well, that's great. And that is true. You know, you have families that have different stories. But one of the things that I have, continue to do is continue to talk to the family and talk to the elders and different members of the Chi'inde about where their families were and what they did. And we can find, in some cases, homestead patterns and them living amongst certain communities here in Southwest New Mexico. So it's not something that I'm doing alone. This is what you call community participatory research or participatory action research, bringing all of these stories about where all these people have been. In fact, I was talking to my cousin who was speaking moments ago, and she was telling me about her father mentioning Senecu as a village in the family's history as one of the ancestral residences. And so we know that as part of the story. But if we don't talk to the family members, we don't have the whole story. And so no one is holding all of the story, as you have said. I agree with the different perspectives. Any other question? I see Dylan McDonald from the archives there at NMSU, an archivist there. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wonder if you could maybe let us know what is probably the biggest obstacle for the Chi'inde getting federal recognition? Is it the lack of these documented sources? I mean, you put in an application. What is the response regarding your application?
So currently we are in the evaluation process for the first phase. That means that we had the opportunity to present a petition and to go through a public comment period. And what that public comment period was 120 days for people to speak in support or opposition of our petition. And then it is being evaluated at present to determine whether or not we are descended from a historical Apache tribe. And from there are other parts of the process. For instance, the Code of Federal Regulations, 25 Part 83, distinguishes that we have to demonstrate that we are a distinct community, meaning that we're different from Mescalero and that we're different from San Carlos or White Mountain, right? And do so from the 1900s to the present. We have to also have our own political governance system. So we have a tribal council, and we have our own constitution or governing documents. Those are also required. We have to have a dissent and a membership list. We have those. Okay, and we cannot ever have been terminated or previously denied. And so we haven't had any of those things happen to us. So the government is evaluating us on all those 7 fronts. So that's part of the process. And there's no guarantee how long that could take. Some people say it could take 10 years. So we'll find out. Hopefully ours doesn't take that long. Good question. Next question.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, in the red shirt.
I was wondering about the people south of the border. Who were their leaders, and what was their population, and what was happening there during the same time as you were describing with Mangus, Colorado, and Geronimo and everything, that 50-year period.
Okay, so a couple of things. What's happening now with those folks, and I'll work my way back, is that in 2024, they were recognized by the nation of Mexico as being an indigenous group, they too were working on their federal acknowledgement, if you will. So they just received that. But as far as we know, in the 1940s time frame, there were roughly 30 families described as living in the mountains there by a rancher who was a trusted rancher, interviewed by an anthropologist who traveled south there. And this gentleman came across, just unknowingly, a village of these same people living there who described themselves as Apache, and there were descendants of people who had lived there, as well as other groups, including the Chiende or Chiende people. So they were related. And so that was evidence that some groups were still living at that time in seclusion. Prior to that, in the late 1800s, there was movement of these people up into Arizona and New Mexico and back and forth all the time. In fact, some of the same group under the Apache leader, who were living at the San Carlos Apache Reservation. And before that, living south of there in the state of Arizona as we know it at the Chiricahua Apache Reservation. So some of these same groups were living in the present day United States, but in the 18 late 18, well, let's say 1870s and 1880s. And then prior to that, there was the 1850s and 60s time frame. There was evidence of this group living over in Doña Ana County, near Fort Thorne. And prior to that, in the Mimbres area, in the old Fort Webster area, which is no longer in existence. And in the area related to the lower Mimbres. So that was that time frame. Good question. So these same groups that were living down there also lived up here, depending on proximity. But these mountain ranges did not limit, the Apache territory was more based on mountain ranges than it was limited by modern day national borders. Any other questions?
That might be it.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time,
Thank you.
and it's been a joy presenting to you. Guess we'll stop recording. Thank you, everyone that logged in from home or work as well on Zoom. See you on April 11th. And if you can make it up to Quemado, we'll see you in May.